In this demonstration, I'm going to introduce you to the selection tools in Adobe Photoshop and some of the key components of those selection tools that we'll want to work with, including adjusting the tools in the tool options bar to suit your particular needs. Now, this is just one example of making selections. There's many different ways, creative ways, in fact, of making selections. And I'm just going to share with you some of the things that I've found to be easier, and I'm going to be dealing with the following tools in your toolbar: the Move tool, the Marquee tools, the Lasso tools, and your Quick Selection and Magic Wand tools. So let's take a look at this image here. Now, this is just a stock image that I downloaded and paid for. Hey, it's always good to have an account with iStock. And let's take a look at some of the components of this image. One of the things that you notice is that it's on a white background, and this leaves us a lot of leverage in making selections with these tools that we would not have if this character was placed on a background that had like a heavily pixelated background, maybe an intricate sky or some sort of cityscape. But for introduction of the tools, of these selection tools, this image will work out perfectly for our needs at this time. So one of the things that we might want to do, for example, is maybe we want to colorize the orange so that it matches the blue of the rest of the image. Say this was our intended goal. I might choose, in this case, one of the Marquee tools. Notice how I click and hold on the selections for the Marquee tools, and you come up with rectangular marquee, elliptical marquee, single row, and single column. And I could talk to you just a little bit about what each one of these does. They're kind of self-explanatory. In fact, the rectangular marquee tool makes a rectangular selection, and incidentally, if I want to get out of a selection, a quick key for deselect on the Mac is Command D or Control D on the PC. The elliptical marquee tool, it makes a circular selection. If I hold the Shift key down, it constrains my selection to a circle. If I just click and hold and move the mouse across the image, it makes an elliptical selection. And I'm going to go Command D or Control D to deselect that selection. Now, the single row or single column, also self-explanatory. We can select a single 1-pixel row across an image, and sometimes that's important if you notice that your image that you've scanned in has just like 1 pixel across of a border that you want to get rid of. So it can be helpful in that way. We've got the single column marquee tool, and if I one click on the window, the image window, it selects 1 pixel, and if we zoom in really closely, you can see that it is 1 pixel wide. So that's what those two tools do. Now, I would say that the vertical 1 column selection tool is helpful for me mostly if I were making a repeating background in a web page. In that case, if I had maybe a gradient that I wanted to repeat across the entire background behind a web page component or a designed web page, then I might select 1 pixel of that gradient across, down the entire column, and then I could use that as a repeating JPEG background image. So I've used that in that case, or if I had a border that I wanted to remove, a really difficult but 1 pixel border I wanted to remove from an image. So if I wanted to choose this only, this orange little cranium of this guy, I could use the elliptical marquee tool, but to get the exact ellipse would take some time, and it wouldn't be the best tool to choose. So the tool that I would actually want to use might be the magic wand tool. Now notice the magic wand tool has the following default settings in the tool options bar. The tolerance is set to 10, and I've got it set to anti-alias, all of the pixels that surround the color, and it's going to select a similar or contiguous group of pixels that carry the same color or tonal range. So if I click here in the middle of this elliptical shaped head, notice how it selects this section but not this. And that's probably because our tolerance was set to only selecting a range of 10 pixels that were in that orange or tonal range. So I can bump up the tolerance settings. Let's try 25 and see if that buys us any more. It did in fact get us a little more within that tonal range, but didn't get this cranium in its entirety. So let me try a tolerance of, just to be crazy, 100, and let's see if that gets us what we need. That almost got us the selection that we needed. And actually, if I click up here in the lighter section of this shape, it selected this ellipse in its entirety. So the magic wand tool works more with contiguous similar colors, pixels that are next to one another that are similar in color or tonal range. So I'm going to deselect that. And now let's look at some of the other selections and what happens to them if you try to move them or make some changes. So I'm going to bring up my layers panel, and I'm going to change this background into an actual layer, so it's something that we can work with that's not locked. If I double click on the lock, it unlocks the layer and gives it a name, so I'm going to call this question dude. How about question dude? Alright, that'll work. And now I'm going to just show you what happens if I use this rectangular marquee tool. If I click and drag, it makes a rectangle, and I can drag it across the image and see how that works. But similar to the ellipse tool, if I hold down the shift key, it constrains that selection to a square. If I wanted to remove this section of the question mark, this might be the easiest tool to use. I can just click and drag, and I can either delete. Of course, that's going to give us a big hole in the image. I'm going to undo what I just did using my history panel, go back to the rectangular marquee selection that I just made. The other thing I could do if I wanted to move this, up, say I felt it was just a little too tight or a little too close to the rest of the character, then I could use the move tool after I have made selection, and I can bump it up. And notice how it still gives us, an emptiness. If we look at our layers, you could easily get rid of that by adding a new layer, pulling it below our question dude, deselecting our rectangular selection, and then I could go to the default colors of black and white, change my foreground color to white, and then I could simply fill in that white area. Now I have a little more breathing room, and maybe it's a little too far away. But that's how the move tool can be used in conjunction with these marquee tools. So remember, if you click and hold on the tool, you're going to find other options below. So that pretty much covers those marquee tools. I'm going to move on now to the lasso tools. The lasso tool was kind of the original tool that came with Photoshop. And depending on how adept you are at using the mouse, it helps you to kind of quickly select an area within something. I just kind of drew a selection around the little point of the question mark, and now I could even move that up if I felt that I needed to move that more closely. And I got to make sure that my question dude layer is selected, because that's the layer that I want to manipulate. And now I can move that little point up, like so. And notice how we no longer have that empty space because we had placed a white layer below the question dude. So if I want to deselect, I'm going to Command D or Control D. So that's what the lasso tool does. And it's handy for quick selections in areas where you have a lot of breathing room. And in this case, we do have a lot of room to work with. However, it can be kind of cumbersome when you have more exact details to work with. The polygonal lasso tool works really well when you're dealing with corners and points. So if I wanted to begin selecting around, maybe there was something very specific. Maybe I wanted to select just something in this light blue highlight of this dude. I could use, there's a lot of different ways I could do that, but I could use the polygonal lasso tool. And the way that it works is I click, and I am literally setting points every time I click, and it's almost like it adheres to creating a line to every point that I create as I click. So I'll click around there, and I can kind of be sloppy within here, this section, because I've got a little bit of room to work with. If I get the little O, notice how if I hover close to my origin of the starting point where I began with the polygonal lasso, notice how the cursor shows a little O, meaning I'm close to the origin of that lasso tool selection. If I click, it now closes that selection. And if I zoom in, you can see that I did a pretty good job of selecting that section that I intended to select. But probably in this case, this may not have been the best tool to select with, because that's more of a tonal or color selection that we were interested in. In that case, once again, the magic wand tool might have been a better choice because we could choose contiguous pixels within that tonal range. Now the tolerance is set too high. We could try a smaller tolerance of 10, let's say, for example, and that more quickly selects everything that was near the nearest neighbor in that same tonal range. It did not select this little section of that light blue highlight. If I want to add to a selection, I can do so very easily by holding the Shift key down. When I press the Shift key, notice how the magic wand tool cursor has a little plus sign. That little plus sign means I want to add to my selection. So then I added that section of blue, and now I have successfully selected that little highlight of the question dude. The next tool in our toolbox of the lasso tools is the magnetic lasso tool. So the magnetic lasso tool is similar to the polygonal lasso tool, but it tries to be a little bit smarter, especially if you're working with a mouse instead of a tablet, and it tries to second guess or guess for you what tonal range you may be trying to select. So I'm going to delete or deselect what I have in the question dude, and let's say, for example, I want to select everything that's in this tonal range of this guy. The magnetic lasso tool, if I start, let's just start over here on this side, and I click, and I start clicking around to add points within this selection. Notice how if I attempt to veer off into the white, because it's a completely different tonal range than the blue, it's not allowing me to go there. In fact, it's constraining or magnetically keeping that line adhering to that edge. And so the magnetic lasso tool can be really forgiving and really helpful for making selections in which there's a very distinct change in tonal range, and it allows you to be just a little more free. See how it won't let me select anything in this other blue tonal range? It continues to adhere to this line. And it can be very helpful in that it keeps me on task, and I can actually be a little bit sloppy. But notice I can't be too sloppy in my selection. It seemed to indicate that it was these two blues were in the same tonal range, whereas it was keeping me honest around this selection. So maybe I need to adjust or refine this tool a little bit, and maybe adjust my width and frequency or the contrast. Okay, so we had the contrast set to 10%. Maybe I need to set that contrast a little bit lower to keep me selecting only within that tonal range. So I'm going to go Command D, and I'm going to give it a try. Let's bump the contrast down to 5%. And let's see if we can constrain ourselves just a little bit better in making this selection. And so this actually makes the selecting process go rather quickly. Oops, I'm moving through, and it's seeing that a little bit better than it did the previous attempt. And it's keeping me on task again when I get near to that white. And when I reach the origin of that selection, I get the little O, and I click, and now it has made that selection for me. So those are the lasso tools for selection. And there's one other selection tool that I haven't talked about yet, and it's a really smart and quick selection. In fact, it's called the Quick Selection tool. It also tries to sense what you're selecting based on tonal range. And notice how quickly I was able to select the question dude body in its entirety, almost, with the exception of this tiny little tidbit at the end of where the hands might be. So I'm going to deselect this, and notice how quickly I can simply select that ellipse for the question dude's cranium. So the quick selection tool, depending on your brush size and the relative hardness of the brush, that refers to how much you want this selection to anti-alias out to the edge. How sensitive do you want this selection to be? If you want it to be as sensitive to 1 pixel, you would use a very small brush and a very hard brush. And then you could go in and you could select something very specific. Let me zoom in so you can see this as an example. Using my quick selection tool, and see it selected 1 pixel and very hard brush. And as I add the shift key, it's only selecting little bit by little bit. And that actually would be rather tedious and not the setting that I usually do. So as a general rule, with the quick selection tool, I typically will go for kind of a medium-sized brush, and I start in the middle range for hardness. So kind of a medium, soft brush. And then if we zoom back out, as I kind of click and hold and drag that brush around, I can select things that are in kind of a similar tonal range. Notice how it first wants to select these darker blue tonal range. If I hold the shift key down, Then I can add to that selection. Initially, it wants to select everything in this light blue tonal range. Holding the Shift key down, I can then add to that selection, but if I hold it down too much, it selects more than I want. So these settings are something that I encourage you to play with, working with these various selection tools. And as a challenge, in the next demonstration, I will give you a few things that I want to see you work on specifically with each of these tools to kind of get accustomed to working with them. And this concludes the introduction to the selection tools.